Thank you everyone for that warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight. I hope you might have patience while I try and take you on a bit of a magical mystery tour through a number of sites and ideas. My work tends to mix myth, history, possibility and fiction in looking at ways in which we can creatively engage with the world. I thought I'd open with one of my favorite quotes, which is, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." It's attributed to Hassan al-Sabah, the legendary old man of the mountains who gave both the Crusaders and the Saracens quite a lot of trouble. He was infamously the founder of the so-called Hashishin, where he had various assassins at his disposal who, and this is where it spins off into legend, he would give his disciples visions of paradise through the ingestion of hashish and lead them through into pleasure gardens filled with virgins. And supposedly this glimpse into paradise would make them ready to die at his command. And they would go off into far-flung kingdoms, both Christian and Muslim, and at the appointed hour, sometimes after serving as Grand Vizier for 20 years in a very trusted position, strike in the night, leaving only a telltale dagger behind. The figure of al-Sabah is an interesting one to start with. In a lot of ways, a lot of theorists and other people have speculated that he's almost the figure of the original terrorist that has been sort of caricatured in various ways down through kind of history. I've even been to a lecture that suggested the persona of Jafar in Disney's Aladdin was loosely based on al-Sabah. What becomes more interesting when you actually go into the history of it is al-Sabah was actually a deeply spiritual mystic who actually, for his time, was a very radical thinker. He was of the Ismaili sect, later more commonly known under the aegis of the Aga Khan, who are actually known for their charitable works and actually generally persecuted by more mainstream Islam. And his, this line, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," comes from his Apocrypha, his kind of codex of secret writings, which even today look very heretical and radical by the standards of kind of more orthodox Islam. And I just wanted to start with him because he's a really interesting figure in the way he crosses cultures and the people he's influenced. He's been quoted by everyone from Aleister Crowley, the kind of English great beast, the sort of magician, to William Burroughs and countless others, including actually even the science fiction writer Roger Zelazny uses him as a figure in one of his books. And without further ado, I'm going to move into my first slide, so maybe we can hit the lights, please. And I think what I'm really interested in is that nothing is as true or as authentic as we like to think it is. I don't think anything really exists in isolation, and that's something which almost becomes an overarching mantra in my work. So this is a copy of a Persian miniature from Italy from the early 19th century. And what becomes interesting is the conventions of Persian miniature, i.e. the multiple picture plane. The mythical winged beast you see there is Burak, who was the Prophet Muhammad's magical steed who carried him to Jerusalem in his magical night journey. For me, it's one of the most kind of interestingly fantastical elements in the Quran that really almost undermines the sort of rest of the body of the text, which is sort of far more rational and kind of legal. I love that fact that anything, no matter how much it attempts to kind of pretend to rationalism and rationality, actually always has its fantasy side, its eruption into a kind of more mythic transcendent space. And I love this particular page, which is from a book, roughly translated, the sort of stories antique and modern costumes, stories of the military, religions, and arts sciences of all the people, ancient and modern. And this attempt in Italy to kind of create a book that would contain everything that ever was, is, and might be. And in turn, kind of having a go at the Persian miniature. You might have seen in the previous slide, maybe I'll jump back to it, the representation, bottom right, of the Kaaba in Mecca, which is actually more square in real life, but obviously is not often seen, or wasn't seen at that stage in history by many non-Muslims. But this idea of the square will come to kind of have a relationship in my work. So we step into Samuel Beckett, and I'm very interested in Beckett. Beckett does some interesting things with language, which I think are very kind of in the spirit of Islamic thought. I was actually raised in very much a Sufi tradition, which is the kind of more mystical tradition of Islam. Often, well, very much in the minority. And there's one of the key things about Sufism is the idea that you cannot know the divine. You can search for it all you want. You can spend your whole life in search of this thing and it will remain elusive and out of your grasp. And actually that is something that should be a cause for celebration. And I think for me there's something in Beckett which speaks to that idea of absence. The very idea of language and the very purity of it, the sort of square and the cross, and this idea of the sort of structure that underlies the whole basis of how people interact. I don't know how many people know Quad by Beckett. It was a very interesting, he actually developed it initially for television, and it involves a grid in which various performers perform a mathematical algorithm around the space of a square. So it prefigures Bruce Naumann's dance around the perimeter of a square and other kind of key conceptual works. And at the bottom, it shows there's basically 4 performers, A, B, C, and D, who move around this center, E. And the bottom shows all the permutations in which they can move around this space. And that's kind of all they do. They move around a space. And in a way, that's what people do, say, even in Mecca around the Kaaba. It's the articulation of space that becomes very, very important. So this is one of a number of works I've done. They're sort of unique variations, and they feature tumbleweeds. The tumbleweeds I actually get from Kansas. They're shipped over to my studio. And inside the tumbleweeds is in neon glass, neon tubes, is Arabic calligraphy. Each one has a different name of God inside the tumbleweed. This one is the Majestic, and basically in the Sufi tradition there are 99 beautiful names of God. These names describe all the different attributes of God, so you have the Majestic, the Merciful, the Compassionate, and it's a really it's a very interesting system. It was first proposed in the 11th century by a Sufi theologian called Al-Ghazali, who basically took all the adjectival nouns by which God was described in the Quran and listed them. He got in a lot of trouble for that at the time because, in a way, the kind of caliphs who were ruling in Baghdad thought to kind of, if God had multiple names, you were kind of going back to a polytheistic religion rather than a monotheistic one. So he had to leave town in a hurry. And what's interesting, or what interests me, is that nothing is fixed, because obviously today the 99 names is as orthodox as you get. You know, you can walk into any Islamic bookshop in any city in the world and they'll have a poster of the 99 names of God. So nothing ever really stays the same. And to refer more specifically to these works, these really came out of a time when the mainstream media were talking about a clash of civilizations. And I was quite interested to kind of refute this. In a way, I often see where cultures are in tension, it's usually because they're more alike than they like to think. And I started thinking about it and thinking about how really there was, in the way America was constructed out of the frontier, fighting colonial enemies on all sides, almost constructing its own belief system from nothing, from the desert, was not at all dissimilar to how Islam began. So I wondered if there was actually more in common there, and somehow this idea of trying to look for a more hopeful resolution of opposites brought me just to this epiphany I had one evening of the name of God blazing out from inside the tumbleweed, that actually these cultures could sit together and actually probably had more in common than they might like to think at first glance. I actually set the whole thing, so the black plinth it's all set within is also part of the work for me, and both references the black square of the Kaaba in Mecca, but more importantly represents the monolith, which is one of the earliest forms of belief. Neolithic monoliths were very much even the basis of Stanley Kubrick's 2001. A Space Odyssey, where you have the apes going crazy with the apparition of the black monolith very early in the film. And this idea of sort of belief, mystery, and magic is something that kind of creeps through my work. I don't really, I perhaps like to make relationships between things that shouldn't be related. So this is a still from a film of mine called A Mystery Play, which follows the whole Masonic system of initiation through its various degrees as reimagined by Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley actually added, in standard classical Freemasonry, there's 10 degrees of initiation, and Aleister Crowley, not to be outdone, invented 11. And so I kind of wanted to kind of work through that. And I'm very interested in how these different things parallel each other. There's so many links between medieval alchemy, mystical Islam, Freemasonry. I'm really interested in systems, but also not frightened to kind of be interested in the magic that goes with them. So we come to systems again. This is an installation that Carol referred to called Until the End of the World. This was staged in Dubai in 2008, and the neon on the right is two sequential lines from the last section of the Quran that are then reflected, mirrored in a series of mirrored panels on the left. The spectator actually, the corner that you see in there, you'd enter from the opposite corner, so the viewer would actually step in and almost complete the circuit. And you're not seeing a true image of it here, because actually the red and the blue were on an alternator, so one would flash on and the other would flash off. And the two lines, the line in red says, "And on that day the quaking one will quake," and the blue line says, "And what comes after will follow." And those lines come from the last section of the Quran, which is perhaps, again, like I was saying, most of the Quran is very, very rational and very, very straight, and the last section kind of goes off into kind of more poetic, philosophical language, and is not too dissimilar from, say, the Gnostic Gospels in Christianity in terms of the way they go off into a far more esoteric doctrine. What interested me and why I called this piece Until the End of the World is from a lot of kind of commentaries, this section of the Quran is the closest Islam comes to talking about reincarnation. And I was really interested in how, interestingly, I grew up as a sort of Muslim between Pakistan and India, and one of the key things that kind of gets Muslims and Hindus into kind of vocal arguments is the doctrine of reincarnation, because that's seen as Hindu and kind of bad for Muslims, and vice versa. That these the silly Hindus, they actually think you're going to come back as a dog, and then the Hindus think those silly Muslims, you think you just die and that's it. And actually, the belief systems, it's often those arguments come through ignorance, through people who haven't actually looked into the texts of both doctrines. This is the staging of Waiting for Godot. This was a work called Inshallah, and this was done in Milan in 2008, also in 2008. And this was a sort of live performance, which was also, I basically documented a rehearsal on video, which is a split-screen video work, and then it was also done as a live performance over a number of nights. And this piece really came up by accident. A lot of my films and more interactive projects just happen in particular places, often through conversations, accidents, and kind of creating a set team of people around me that makes something happen. And I happened to be in Milan discussing a possible exhibition with a gallery there, and I was out taking a walk, and I came across a bilingual school for Arab immigrants in Milan. And that just got me thinking about how Samuel Beckett liked to translate his own work. And Beckett was famously bilingual. He did his own, not just translations, but he often rewrote some of his works between English and French. But actually, a lot of people don't know he was actually trilingual and did his own translations into German as well. And I think it's, for me, that's one of the things I'm most impressed with Beckett, because the idea of the specific meaning in specific languages was so key to him that only he could really translate his own work. And the meanings often change. There's one of his works in English is called play, and in French it's called comédie, which is the French word for play, but he also kind of makes a joke on the fact that comédie, if you spell it in French, is C-O-M-E-D-I-E, so it actually means come die. So there's a really interesting way in which Beckett uses language, and in Waiting for Godot, obviously there's the obvious idea of waiting for God and this idea of the absence of God, which actually seemed to me to figure into a lot of Sufi Islamic ideas of God being absent, or you're not being able to know God. And so I actually worked with a translator and we had the temerity to retranslate Beckett into Arabic, but thinking about specific meanings and changes. And I actually thought it was kind of humorous to cast two young girls as the two tramps in Waiting for Godot. So they've both got fake mustaches on, and one was the daughter of Egyptian immigrants and the other the daughter of Moroccan immigrants. And what became interesting was that they obviously didn't speak quite the same Arabic. So we had to kind of approximate. So all these ideas of translation, nothing is quite as fixed as we would like to have it. Move on. This is a cosmological diagram from the 11th century by Ibn Arabi, who's one of my, he's a really great inspiration and influence on me. Ibn Arabi was a great Sufi mystic, and in fact, I actually struggled to really get to grips with Ibn Arabi for many, many years, despite him being kind of, various family and other people kind of saying, you must read this. And there's a really amazing book called Alone with the Alone by the French scholar Michael Corbin, C-O-R-B-I-N, which is one of the most beautiful books ever in terms of an understanding of Ibn Arabi and his particular approach to Sufism, which talks about a movement between the beloved and the loved, and this movement where they come together in kind of harmony. But Ibn Arabi, as well as being a kind of theologian of love or divine love, was also very ahead of his time in terms of his understanding of sort of sacred energies in the cosmos. So this is a cosmological diagram of the various forces and interplays at work on both a practical and kind of hermetic level. It also actually, maybe I should say this and I won't sound too weird, but one of the wonderful things about being an artist is that you don't have to be as kind of straight in your methodology as an academic. I'm also an academic, but it's wonderful when I don't have to be. And one of the things I found very interesting was late one night researching various cosmological diagrams from the 11th century, and I happened to come across a number of eyewitness drawings to UFO sightings, and I actually found a striking similarity between these. And I spoke to another friend of mine who's an academic, and he said, well, have you tried looking at 4th century Chinese astronomical maps? And the kind of consonance in terms of the geometry, the layout of the cosmos between something happening in 11th century Baghdad to something happening in 4th century China to something happening maybe 20 years ago in various UFO sightings, whether in Europe or in the US, was kind of uncanny and startling. And that's a nice way to lead into my textile paintings, which I kind of see as a kind of way of working syncretically with layers of existing found material and what I put on top. All these paintings of mine are on Sindhi Sami quilts, generally from the 1970s. They're wonderful objects in their own right. They're actually made by nomadic artisans who kind of live around the city of Karachi, where I grew up. And what was really interesting in the 70s, these nomadic craftsmen, they basically move around and create huts, and the quilts kind of move with them. So the quilts are actually the continuity of their home, and the quilts can act as basically, as they define space. So the quilts can be the living room, the dining room, the bedroom. So they have this kind of beautiful essence of, or trace of, these people's kind of narrative and history. But in the 1970s, Pakistan had a suddenly booming textile industry. And so you had all these factories growing up around the province of Sindh, and the nomadic weavers started building their huts around the factories, which I'm sure wasn't very good for the quality of the water, but what it did mean was they started incorporating all the offcuts from the factories into their patternways. So you had this very odd interplay between mass-produced and handcrafted. And what was interesting as well is that the quilts started becoming infected in a very positive way by patterns coming in from places as diverse as Lagos, Japan, China, the Netherlands. So again, it wasn't as pure as this idea of, I mean, I really love things that kind of undo an idea of authenticity, because it's so elusive and fleeting. This is another one called Island 2. And interestingly, one of the ideas that one comes across in Sufism quite often is the idea of the prism. You know, like with early photography, often that you'd see something upside down. And this obviously predating photography, you'd have this idea that somehow the world was upside down as we saw it, you know, to the untrained eye. And I love this idea that, you know, there's a whole other world behind the veil of what is seen. And that's an idea that comes up again and again. And interestingly, there's a very similar symbol of the inverted tree in medieval alchemy. This idea that somehow what we see is not true. And that's something that kind of, I like to think of my work as pointing to other possibilities in that way. I don't know if anybody makes it out, but actually there's the figure coming out from bottom right into the canvas is actually the back of a moai from Rapa Nui, interfacing with an Islamic star pattern. Talking about things being authentic, often I'll also cut up fragments of the textiles and re-stitch them to make my base canvas. And the blue paisley pattern is a key indicator of something that, you know, Paisley is, I don't know if many people know, but it's a town in Scotland. And, you know, that pattern, you know, was originally an Indian pattern that, well, some people would contest that and say it was a Persian pattern that made its way to India and then made its way via Paisley in Scotland to having a very particular function in the 1960s. So nothing's quite as true as we'd like to think. This brings me on to a recent project called the New Dream Machine project. This was something I'd been researching for a number of years before I ever got the funding to really develop it further. And I don't know how many people know of Brian Gysin, who was a key kind of figure of the counterculture in the 60s and a longtime friend and collaborator of William Burroughs. And together with a British scientist called Ian Somerville, he developed something called the Dream Machine, which was roughly about 50 centimeter tall cylinder with a pattern cut out and a light bulb inside. And it sat on a 78 RPM turntable, and the idea was, by looking at it close up with your eyes shut, the flicker generated on the back of the eyelids at that revolution would generate alpha waves in the brain, akin to either deep meditation or dream sleep, hence the Dream Machine. And I'd always wanted to kind of work with this idea of the Dream Machine because Gysin had spent, as well as Burroughs, spent a lot of time in Tangiers in Morocco in the 60s and were heavily influenced by Islamic pattern. And the whole idea of, in Sufism, you have the whirling dervishes who through kind of turning and rotation send themselves into trance. So this idea, this kind of hybrid meeting ground of North Africa and the counterculture of the US just seemed very fertile ground for me. On the left is Abdellah Karoum, a Moroccan curator friend of mine, and that's me on the right with our first prototype Dream Machine we were working on. And cutting out a huge story and saga in between, that's the kind of 3 meter tall version. You guys don't use meters here, do you? So what is that then? It's about 10, 12 feet, isn't it?
3 meters?
Yeah, 10 feet. So that's the 10-foot tall version, which I was interested in making a giant one and taking it back to Tangiers. Gysin, after being kind of sidelined by art history for many years, was kind of recently rediscovered by key exhibitions at the New Museum in New York and other big museums in Paris. But both of those exhibitions, while bringing Gysin back into the mainstream, sidelined his time in Tangiers, which just seemed so pivotal in the kind of development of his ideas and that sort of hybridization of his ideas. And so I was really interested to make a really giant dream machine. And I kind of played with, over the years, this object has become quite a cult object, so various scientists and artists have suggested how it could have been improved. One of the ways was to replace the single white light with twin-colored lights, which I did, and creating cylinders that rotated counterclockwise to each other. And so I was interested to improve this thing and take it back to Tangiers, which is exactly what I did. And I took it back to Tangiers, and I was very kindly invited by a friend to stage a Dream Machine concert at the Cinematheque de Tangier, which is an old cinema from the 1920s that was recently restored. And what we did was we kind of imagine where you're sitting now. We took out the central row of seats and extended the cinema stage into the audience, so they'd be sitting in a semicircle, which is a classic Sufi formation. When you listen to Sufi music, you sit in a semicircle, often on the floor, and Sufi concerts go on for hours. You actually go, you go into a state of reverie and trance. And so we took the machine there, and Gysin, when he lived in Tangiers in the 60s, together with his lover, the Moroccan painter Mohamed Hamri, they had a cafe called the 1001 Nights. And the house band in the 1001 Nights Cafe were the master musicians of Jajuka. And now the master musicians of Jajuka trace their lineage back about 500 years or more. And their origins are pre-Islamic. Jajuka is a village in the Rif Mountains in Morocco where to this day they still celebrate the rite of Pan every spring. And the Jajuka music combines a sort of pagan worship of Pan with Islamic Sufism into a kind of a very particular vibration that, to my mind, has an effect very similar to the machine. just to kind of add to the kind of crazy melting pot that was happening in Morocco in the 60s, the Rolling Stones turned up. And Brian Jones, one of the founders of the Rolling Stones, so the story goes, actually had taken so many drugs that the rest of the Rolling Stones got fed up and left him there. And Brian Jones kind of woke up apparently in a bit of a mess and was obviously quite distressed to have been abandoned. And so Geisen and Hamri took him to Jajuka to meet the master musicians. And he was so impressed, he went back a year later and recorded a now seminal album called Brian Jones Presents the Pipes of Pan at Jajuka. So we couldn't get Brian Jones for the gig, but we got the master musicians of Jajuka. And instead of Jones, I took out a contemporary British guitarist called Duke Garwood to stand in for Jones and to kind of jam with the master musicians of Jajuka, totally improvised and impromptu. I think there's something quite interesting in a certain amount of risk capital with a project. But I'm going to shelve that for a minute and come back to that in a bit. I sort of followed on with this idea of the pattern in the dream machine. This is a piece called The Pattern of the Plan. And I was quite interested to see if you could replicate the effect of the machine actually by having just a flat wall-based work. So this is a neon that kind of jumps around and kind of hopefully sends you into a somewhat heightened state if you look at it long enough. And then this is another neon called Ville Urbaine, which is based on a weird combination of my interests in Corbusier's architecture and the tantric art of Rajasthan. I don't know how many people know, but Corbusier was invited after independence in India to master plan the new city of Chandigarh, which was a key project in Nehru's post-colonial India. Corbusier was very influenced by esoteric thought. This was generally not acknowledged till very recently when new scholarship showed that a lot of his drawings and ideas were influenced by sort of esoteric thoughts such as theosophy and anthroposophy that were kind of very big at the time he was working. And I was just very interested to think about whether there was a connection or some sort of influence. So it wasn't just Corbusier influencing India, but India influencing Corbusier. So, you know, this neon combines elements taken from Corbusier's designs with key elements of sort of tantric representation, such as the sort of male and female poles that are the kind of odd shapes, which almost look like the heads going up and coming down. And I took this into some of the textiles. This one is called YTR3, which YTR stands for Yantra, which is a form of tantric abstract representation of usually of a sort of mystic poles of male and female. And this idea of the sort of alchemical wedding between cultures, between different poles, this was something I tried to work with in a film I made in 2008 called Feature. Feature is a Western set in the English countryside with Hindu gods and Nordic Valkyrie, and ends with a Valkyrie singing the aria from Sieglinde, from Wagner's Valkyrie, to Billy the Krishna, an amalgam of Billy the Kid and Krishna of Hindu mythology. And this idea of systems, circles, abstract representations of the structure behind the nature of things, and ideas of birds in flight. Birds in flight appear in a lot of kind of Sufi poetry and storytelling. Birds often representing man's desire for the divine through both sexual union and mystical union. And this is something I've worked with in various works. So these are drawings on vintage illustrations, Victorian illustrations, and they're in a way sketches towards these neon works in which I use taxidermied exotic birds flying through arcs in space. That's a close-up of a toucan. And somehow in all of this I was interested in how these sort of elliptical and circular geometry comes back to from abstraction to some of these UFO patterns I was seeing earlier on. This is probably the largest textile I've ever done. It's about 12 or 14 foot wide, and it's called Inside the Spaceships. And this was done around my most recent film, which is still just being finished as we speak. My most recent film is Piercing Brightness, and it's my first feature-length film. It uses science fiction as a way to talk about ideas of race, migration, and almost suggesting that rather than the more kind of divided way in which we kind of often look at each other between different cultures, perhaps there's a common ancestry that supersedes all of that. And I just thought I'd show you as a kind of teaser a few production stills from the film. So this is the arrival of the aliens. The aliens in my piece are actually Chinese and Mandarin speaking. And it mixes sort of abstraction, more poetic imagery with more kind of straight imagery that might come straight out of Close Encounters. And it really sort of mixes up cultures. So this sort of Chinese aliens have a kind of God in the machine, who's this master lady who speaks to them in an almost pre-Arabic. So the film is actually in 4 languages with various main characters. And she kind of can reach them through technology. I was quite interested in technology not always being seen as a bad thing, but maybe as some sort of harbinger of the kind of voice of otherworldliness. And this is, I made a special trailer for the film, which obviously rather than being in cinema theaters I actually designed as an installation. This was on view at Modern Art Oxford recently, and I quite like the idea of presenting the trailer for a film in a museum that you'd then have to go and see in a cinema theater, as a way of kind of breaking the borders between those spaces. And how long have we got? I was just going to play a little, since I haven't shown any of the films, I thought I'd just play the film that was made in Tangiers. That's why I said I'd shelve that thought till now. This is the film called New Dream Machine Project, which rather than just being a simple documentary of that gig in Tangiers, we actually cut it and edited it so it would have the same flicker frequency as the machine, and the audio would also play to that frequency. It's 13 minutes long, so it doesn't represent the whole event. The original concert was 3 hours long.